Today we're in chapter 4 of the book of Exodus. We will continue to look at Moses' interaction with YHVH, or Yahweh, or Jehovah, however you want to say it. And this occurs at the burning bush. And where was that burning bush? It's identified on your map that you have there. It doesn't say burning bush, but it does say Mount Sinai. Moses was at Mount Sinai when he observed the burning bush, and that's where God had this conversation with him. Now, Moses seemed to listen to God and what he had to say, but in the final analysis, when God told him to get to work, to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, Moses had all kinds of excuses. His first excuse was, hey, look, I'm a nobody. Nobody will listen to me. The second excuse was that I don't even know who to tell them sent me. And he said, tell them, I am that I am has sent you. Remember, he was also YHVH, which is I was, I am, and I will be. That's what defines God. And it's not like us, because I was, and I am, and I will be. But in God's case, he was, he is, and he will be all at the same time. We have to go through time to experience that. God doesn't. He told Moses he was the self-existent one, that he was the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And remember, we talked last week about the fact that that indicates that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive. He doesn't say, I was the God of. He said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, they're not alive physically when he says that, but certainly they are alive spiritually. Now, the fact that God called himself the self-existent one is very significant when you consider the fact that these Jews have been living amongst the Egyptians for at least the last 200 years. And the Egyptians worship many gods, called a pantheon, from the word pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God. So they worship all gods. The Egyptians believed that there was a sun god, a moon god, a river god, an amphibian god, an insect god, a rain god, a fire god, and many, many others. And each of their gods had power. And remember, that was the word El, which means a possessor of power. Each of their gods had power in their one little realm. The rain god had power over the rain, but he didn't have power over the frogs. He didn't have power over fire, just over rain. For this reason, it was easy for the Egyptians to think of Pharaoh, who has power over all the people of Israel, as being a god as well. So to them, he truly was a god, just like the rain god and the sun god and the moon god. But we will learn as we go through the negotiations between Moses and Pharaoh that it was not just about letting the Israelites go. It was also a battle between who is the real God. Was Jehovah God just a God over one area, or is he the God over everything, an all-powerful God? So now we're going to pick up the discussion between Moses and God, as Moses comes up with several other excuses as to why he can't do what he's told to do. Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, Yahweh did not appear to you. Yahweh said to him, what is that in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. that they may believe that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Okay, so we see now here that Moses' third objection was that he wasn't believable. The children wouldn't accept him as God's chosen leader. He claims that in spite of the fact that in the previous chapter, God said in Genesis 3:18, then they will listen to your voice. And remember, eventually the Israelites truly did listen to Moses' voice. Now, what was it about Moses that made him think that he was unbelievable? Well, remember that since the time of Jacob, which was some 200 years prior, God had not manifested himself to anybody. And now all of a sudden Moses is claiming, God showed himself to me. Also consider that some 40 years previously, he had gone out to settle an argument between two Hebrews. And he said, why do you strike your companion? And the man answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? God did, right? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. So Moses had some pretty good reasons for believing why they wouldn't believe him. But God's response to Moses was to give him several miracles to perform. And once he performed these miracles, God knew that the Hebrews would listen to him. The first was to take his shepherd's crook and to throw it on the ground, and it was transformed into a snake. Not just the illusion of a snake, but an actual snake. That was only the first half of the sign. And we will learn later on, as he did this in front of Pharaoh, his magicians also took their staffs and threw them down, and they became snakes. But there's a difference, and we'll get to that. Now notice also that there were no magic words or no magic incantation. He just did it on faith. I can imagine Moses standing up there and going, Awa, Tafu, Liam. Sounds kind of Egyptian, doesn't it? Although if you run those all together, Awa, Tafu, Liam, it shows that Moses didn't need any magic incantation. But the second part of the miracle was when he reached out and grabbed him by the tail, and it became his staff again. Now there's a symbol here, and that is the symbol of the serpent. When we as Christians think of the serpent, our minds take us back to the Garden of Eden, where the serpent deceived Eve and caused her to sin. To the Egyptians, however, the cobra, also known as Uraeus, was a symbol of supreme authority and royalty and divinity. In fact, one of the Hebrew headdresses for the king has a cobra on the brow of it, and I've shown you some pictures of it there. So Moses, showing that he had power over the snake, was showing his authority over anyone in Egypt at the time. Remember, he had a crook. It was a shepherd's crook. And remember, the Egyptians considered shepherds to be scum. The scum of the scum. Pond scum, if you will. But the shepherd's crook was also a sign of authority to the Egyptians. In fact, if you look at pictures of Tutankhamun, you'll see some of them that show him with the shepherd's crook and the flail crossed in front of him. What? No, there's not a picture of that in here. So the shepherd's crook could either mean divine authority or total lowlife. But by doing this miracle with his shepherd's crook, Moses showed that though they considered him a lowlife, he had power over them. Verse 6, again, the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. And he put his hand inside his cloak. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. So Moses, without waiting to see if the Egyptians were convinced by the snake thing, he stuck his hand inside his cloak and pulled it out, covered with leprosy. Now, leprosy was the most feared disease of the time. In fact, a leper was considered to be a dead person. So this was a symbol of sin and death. But the fact that Moses could stick his hand inside his cloak and pull it out completely healed showed that he had power over even this most dreaded disease. Verse 9. If they will not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. Where is Moses when he is given these instructions? He's still at Mount Sinai, several hundred miles from the Nile River, so it's not something that he could do in front of God to make sure it works. Which means that when he does do it, he has to do it completely by faith. Now, the Nile was a symbol of life to the Egyptians. It was the life-giving water literally for the whole country. They irrigated their crops with it. And in fact, once a year, the Nile would flood, and it would bring new sediment onto the ground that would revitalize the land. So the Nile was life to them. And it was represented by the god Osiris, who was the god of life. He also was the god of death, but we'll get into that later. So now this shows that Moses has power over the Nile, over the god Osiris, even the power over life and death. God has just given Moses 3 miracles as witnesses. And we'll remember that later on when Moses gave him the law, he said this, a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. So God said, you have to have 2 or 3 witnesses before we'll carry on. So God gave him 3 miracles. And remember that Jesus said, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. But God gave him even more. The Nile was considered the source of all life, as I said before. And by Moses turning the water into blood, indicated that he had power to give that life force and turn it into death. But Moses said to the Lord, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent." Interesting, he said, "Oh, my Lord." We'll talk about that in just a second. "I'm not eloquent, neither in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue," which literally means heavy of speech and heavy of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, "Who made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now, therefore, go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." You can see that God is starting to get a little bit perturbed with Moses. Moses said, "I'm not a gifted communicator." Now, the first objections could be seen as modesty or uncertainty. This time, it is downright refusal to do what God told him to do. And in fact, we have the witness of Stephen in the New Testament in Acts chapter 7, where he said, "And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds." So when Moses said, "I'm not eloquent, I'm slow-mouthed and heavy-tongued," That was not the truth. He was giving excuses to God, just like every one of us has to our mother or father at some time. Said, oh, but I didn't do that. It was so-and-so that did. Yeah, right. Now, perhaps, I got to give a little credit to Moses here, perhaps he was not very fluent in Egyptian or Hebrew. Remember, it had been 40 years since he'd been part of the Egyptian hierarchy. Also remember that he did not grow up in a Hebrew household. He grew up in an Egyptian household and was taught by the Egyptians. So surely he knew Egyptian very well, but maybe he didn't really know Hebrew that well. So he could have had a bit of an excuse. It's more likely that he was saying to God, God, make me eloquent. I'm not eloquent enough. Give me more of what I need. But we are not the ones who determine what gifts we have. We are not the ones who determine whether we have a strength or a weakness in a particular area. That's all up to God. And we will see as we go through this that Moses' focus was not on God, it was on himself. He kept making excuses for himself. But God's message to Moses, in effect, was, don't worry about your speaking ability. I'll take care of that. Just trust me. Is not that the crux of the Christian faith? Trust, which could also be translated as faith. Just to become a Christian, we had to have faith. We had to believe that God's message was true, and we had to take the action based on what we were told. Then Moses said, but he said, oh, my Lord, please send someone else. Now here we have that expression, my Lord, again. That comes from the Hebrew word Adonai, which means a master or a boss. So in effect, Moses was saying, hey, boss, send somebody else. Consider that. Here is the God of all creation, the ruler of heaven and earth, the all-powerful, all-knowing God. And Moses is calling him boss. I'm surprised that God didn't strike him down right there. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Do you see why? Is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? Now, if Aaron was his brother and was a Levite, what does that make Moses? A Levite. Okay? So I think what God is doing here is saying, okay, Aaron the Levite is going to be your high priest now. I think it could have been Moses if he'd gone along with it, but nope, not anymore. He lost that one. It's now going to Aaron. Behold, he's coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he'll be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people. He shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. We don't often think of God as getting angry with one he loves. But he does. He even can get angry with us when we refuse to do what he tells us to do. He said to Moses, Aaron is coming out to meet you. Where was Moses at this time? He was at Mount Sinai. And where was Aaron? He was in the land of Goshen. And if you look at your map, you'll see that there's quite a distance between Goshen and Mount Sinai. Okay, God said, take that shepherd's crook of yours, that rod, and do the miracles that I talked to you about, and the Israelites will believe you. When we serve God, we need to always realize that it's God's work and it's God's working. We are just his servants who represent him in the great work. We often want to take credit for witnessing to somebody and having them get saved, when in reality it was God who prompted us to witness. It was God who opened up their heart. It was God who produced the salvation. We need to recognize who God is and what he does. Verse 18, Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, wait a minute. Jethro was not his father-in-law, was he? Remember? Jethro was his brother-in-law. And the word translated father-in-law is simply the word in-law. We talked about that last time. Moses went back to Jethro, his brother-in-law, and said to him, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. The Lord said to Moses in Midian, okay, Moses is no longer at Mount Sinai. He's back in Midian with his brother-in-law. He said, go back to Egypt, for all the men who are seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. Moses took the shepherd's crook, the lowly shepherd's crook, which is now called the staff of God, with him. It makes me think of 1 Corinthians, where God tells us, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. We don't have to be a great Christian to serve God the way he wants us to serve him. In fact, he wants us to recognize our lowly condition. We are nothing without him. We need his power. We need the faith that only he can give us. We need to be able to serve him completely. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. This expression, I will harden his heart. In fact, the word harden here is chizuk, meaning to fasten upon or to strengthen. It's the same word that Joshua used when he said, only be thou strong. So he really said, I will strengthen Pharaoh's heart. Now, as we go through Exodus, we will see back and forth between Pharaoh and Moses, actually between Pharaoh and God. And we'll see the expression, harden his heart, over and over and over again. A number of those times, it's really strengthen his heart. There are two different expressions. And if you read through the English translation, almost any English translation, they translate it as harden his heart every time. This is where a book that I picked up by a Jewish rabbi, not a Christian, a Jewish rabbi, who knows the language completely, and he points out these differences. And we'll go through those as we talk about the relationship between Pharaoh and God. But in this case, I will strengthen his heart so that he will not let the people go. In other words, I'll give him courage to keep on fighting. Now, at some point, God will finally harden Pharaoh's heart, but not until Pharaoh himself has hardened his heart. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. Now this term firstborn son in Hebrew is Bekor, plural being Bekorat. It's the expression given of Abraham's son, Isaac. Now, Isaac was not his firstborn son, was he? Ishmael was his firstborn son. But Isaac was his firstborn son of his wife. And he held a special place in Abraham's heart. Likewise, Jacob had 12 sons. And I believe Joseph was the 10th or 11th of those sons. Yet Joseph was the one who received the inheritance, the double inheritance of the Bechor. He was the firstborn son of the wife that Jacob thought he was working the first 7 years for. He was the one Jacob loved. She was the one Jacob loved. So he really was, in a sense, his firstborn special son. Now, in Hebrews, we're told, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in an act of offering up his only son, or in some cases, only begotten son, which again really means his special son, the one he has special feeling for. Verse 24. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death, referring to Moses. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone, and it was then said, "A bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. Now, apparently, when Moses and Zipporah had their first son, Moses circumcised him, as God had told him to do. But with the second one, apparently he hadn't. Possibly because Zipporah was offended by this bloody ritual that he went through. But because of that, when they got partway back to Egypt, the tradition is that Moses got very sick and was close to death. And Zipporah suddenly remembered that they had not circumcised their second son, so she did it, and then accused him of being a father of blood. Verse 27, Then the Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he went and met him at the mountain of God and kissed him. Where is that mountain of God? Mount Sinai. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord with which he had been sent him to speak, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do. So we see that God had told Aaron to go meet Moses, march those couple hundred miles, while Moses was coming back from Midian, and they met at Mount Sinai. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. What was Moses' complaint? That they're not going to believe that I met with God. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. So what? We notice how willing Moses was to listen to God when God told him all these things. And there is no sense of doubt expressed by Moses at any time. And yet, when God called him to action, suddenly he had excuses. Moses was too focused on himself. You say, wait, Moses was a lowly shepherd. He wasn't no longer a high Egyptian official. But we can tell by Moses' response to God that he didn't think himself to be something great. Instead, he thought of himself as being a nobody, even in God's eyes. You know what that is? That's thinking of self, not God. Now, when God had demonstrated that the excuses wouldn't work and would be overcome, Moses claimed his own weakness as a reason why God's plan wouldn't work. He saw his own weakness and assumed that God was either not willing or not able to overcome these weaknesses. If Moses had been focused on God, he wouldn't have even considered his weaknesses, or his strengths for that matter. But when Moses insisted that God had made the wrong choice and that he should send somebody else, it clearly made God angry. Compare Moses' attitude with that of Abraham. Remember, Lot had separated from Abraham and had gone down into the well-watered plain of the Jordan and lived in Sodom. And the Lord decided that he was going to destroy Sodom. So Abraham was sitting by his tent, and he saw God and two angels coming. That would be pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, the angel of the Lord. And Moses saw them coming, and he prepared a feast for them and stood by them while they ate. And then God told him what he was about to do. He said, I'm going to go down and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin is so great. Then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you, God, to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Shows that Abraham knew his God. And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this one time. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. How many righteous people were there in Sodom? There was Lot, there was his wife, and his 2 daughters. Even if he had negotiated down to 5, God could have agreed. But you see what Abraham did? He had a negotiation with God. I dare say few of us are courageous enough to negotiate with God. But Abraham did it because he knew God. He knew what kind of God he is. So you see the difference between Moses and Abraham is one of personal view. Moses considered himself. Abraham considered God. How is your attitude when you talk to God? Where's your faith when he calls you to action? You say, oh, God's never called me into the pastorate. God's never called me to become a missionary. God's never called me to do this or that or something else. I wonder if God has ever asked you to spend 15 minutes every day reading his word. I wonder if God has ever asked you to pray to him every single day. I dare say he probably has asked every one of us, both of those. And what was your response? Lord, I don't have 15 minutes each day to do that. My schedule is so tight, I just can't. Lord, and I forget about praying, so I'll keep doing what I can, Lord, but you can't hold me accountable. Isn't that how we act? Let's change that. Let's become more like Abraham and recognize who it is we're talking to. Let's take that 15 minutes or half an hour every single day and open the Word and let God speak to us. Let's set aside a certain time, and if you miss it one day, go back to it the next day. Spend time talking with God. He wants fellowship with us. He wants us to listen to him and obey him, but he also wants us to tell him what's on our heart. He may know it already, but he wants us to tell him anyway. So I challenge us, all of us, to dedicate ourselves to doing those two things. Reading the Word every day and praying to God every day. And then when we see things changing in our lives, we know it's not because we're so great, but because he is so great.